Watching is the New York Times' TV and film recommendation newsletter and website. The Night King's acquisition of a dragon is definitely a game-changer, but what does this mean for the poor, revived Viserion? Some fans have started calling him an iced dragon, a name that recalls George R.R. Martin's children's novel, The Iced Dragon, as well as the ice dragons mythologized in the books of A Song of Ice and Fire. But for those who haven't read those stories, what are ice dragons, and is the moniker an apt one? In Martin's children's story, about a little girl who befriends a dragon, we learn that ice dragons are like their smaller cousins, the ice lizards. Their weakness is heat, which can make them melt. The ice dragon's skin is a crystalline white, almost blue, and when it moves, it breaks and crackles like snow does underfoot. And instead of fire, they breathe pure cold. One character explains they're not like real dragons, you know. You can't break them or train them. We have tales of those that tried, found frozen with their whip and harness in hand. I've heard about people that have lost hands or fingers just by touching one of them. Frostbite. Those tales might be similar to the ones Old Nan told at Winterfell, stories that Jon remembers in the books as he ventures further north. Not only is the ice dragon a constellation of stars including one blue star that Jon can use to find true north, the ice dragons are also a metaphor he can use to describe the extreme cold he encounters. Cold as the breath of the iced dragon, cold as the belly of an iced dragon, like walking down the gullet of an iced dragon. The ice dragons were said to be colossal beasts, many times larger than the dragons of Valyria, made of living ice. And just as in the ice dragon, they breathed cold instead of fire, a chill so terrible that it can freeze a man solid in half a heartbeat. Sailors spotted them over the centuries roaming the shivering sea and the white waste, but since ice dragons melt when they die, no one can bring their bodies back as proof, and their existence continues to be debated. All of this makes the ice dragon sound like a completely different species from normal dragons, if any dragon can be considered normal. We've only seen Viserion's changed eye so far, but to be considered an ice dragon, he would need to undergo a much greater transformation, ice-made flesh, the way his brothers are fire-made flesh. And what's more terrifying anyway, an ice dragon, or a zombie dragon? Some of you might have been scratching your heads after Tyrion said to Dany, "You say you can't have children. When did she say this? Did we miss something?" We know the mother of dragons considers her gorgeous beasts her children, which is a big part of what makes losing Viserion so tragic. And we know that her first son was stillborn. But since when does that mean she can't have biologically human children? To understand why Dany believes this, and whether it could be true, we need to revisit her time in Season 1 with the healer witch Mirri Maz Duur, the woman whom she entrusted with giving Khal Drogo back his life, and supplement that with information from the books that has been left out of the show. First, when Dany meets Mirri, she tells Dany that she has midwife skills. "I know every secret of the bloody bed, Silver Lady," Mirri says in the books, "nor have I ever lost a babe." That makes Dany's son, Rhaego, who is stillborn, the first and last one she loses. Curiously, while Dany is in labor, Mirri gives her something to drink. She tasted sour milk, and something else, something thick and bitter. A poison, a natural abortifacient. Later, Mirri claims that the baby was not only stillborn, but a monster. As she says in Season 1, he was scaled like a lizard, blind, with leather wings like the wings of a bat. "When I touched him, the skin fell from his bones. Inside he was full of graveworms." But given that she later admits that she wanted the baby to die, just as she wanted Khal Drogo to remain in a vegetative state, it's hard to treat her account as anything but hearsay. For all we know, Rhaego could have been born alive and perfectly healthy, only to be smothered by Mirri. There is no evidence, no bones presented. When Dany confronts Mirri in the show about Drogo's condition and asks when her call will be as he was before, the healer witch responds with a poetic version of "Never when the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. When the seas go dry and the mountains blow in the wind like leaves." In the books, she adds one more line, the most crucial line in this fertility crisis: "When your womb quickens again, and you bear a living child." Dany interprets that as a prophecy or a curse, and she obsesses over it in the books. The Magi Mirri Maz Duur had sworn she should never bear a living child. Daenerys thinks in A Clash of Kings, and what man would want a barren wife? Later, in A Storm of Swords, she again recalls Mirri Maz Duur had promised that she would never bear a living child. "House Targaryen will end with me." And in A Dance of Dragons, those same fears are once more on her mind. The words of Mirri Maz Duur rang in her head, Martin writes. The meaning was plain enough. Khal Drogo was as likely to return from the dead as she was to bear a living child. Still, who said Miri had the power of prophecy? Why should we believe this woman, given that she previously and purposely misled Dany? What if she was just trying to upset the Khaleesi as much as possible, in order to make her think that the loss of Rhaego was even more significant than it already was, the loss of all prospects of motherhood? It's hard to know. One thing we do know, or at least suspect, is that, despite all of this, Dany does appear to get pregnant once more. In the books, she seems to suffer a miscarriage after eating some green berries, which taste bitter and familiar. Perhaps Miri used them in Dany's secret drink. So what we can conclude clearly, she is able to conceive, but it's too soon to know whether she can carry another baby to term. It was a very talky group that headed north of the Wall. Nearly everyone in Jon Snow's party had some history to discuss. Most of their talks covered recent ground, but one exchange between Jorah and Thoros concerned an event not seen on the show. "There's something I've always wanted to know," Jorah asks him. "How drunk were you when you charged through the breach on Pike?" Jorah is talking about the Siege of Pike, a legendary moment during the First Greyjoy Rebellion, which took place 6 years after Robert's Rebellion. The final battle on Pike, the Iron Island on which the Greyjoys' castle is located, was fought on one side by the unified forces of House Baratheon, House Stark and House Lannister. "That was a proper battle," Jaime Lannister tells Jory Castle in Season 1, when they reminisce about fighting side by side. Jory says he will remember it until the day he dies. Unfortunately, that day comes soon after, and at Jaime's hand. As one of Ned Stark's bannermen, Jorah Mormont was compelled to fight in the siege as well, and it was in this battle that he won his knighthood. King Robert brought his army across Ironman's Bay and landed on Balon's stronghold at Pike, where his stone throwers opened the southern wall breach and shattered the main watchtower. Thoros of Myr was the first man through, scaling the walls with his flaming sword in hand. Jorah was right behind him, as he tells Sir Barristan in Season 3. Jaime Lannister also rushed through and started cutting people down, as Euron Greyjoy later puts it. And it was during that battle that Theon's brothers, Roderick and Meryn, died. With the castle taken, Balon Greyjoy was subdued, and his last remaining son taken as a hostage, word of Ned Stark. The remaining Greyjoys would never forget that battle, nor would anyone else present, only Thoros, who was too drunk to remember. R.I.P. Warrior Priest, The Sins of Sansa Stark. The week you can hand-wave one plot point that has Sansa dispatching Brienne on a snipe hunt, but two that seems like a lot of evidence pointing toward cunning Sansa. If this is indeed the case, then Sansa, who has now claimed credit for Ramsay's defeat, has already proven herself willing to use two of her brothers as bait. If the Knights of the Vale's last-minute arrival wasn't part of the plan, then she deserves no credit. She did betray her family. Arya's right, and she seems poised to do so again. The season of Game of Thrones feels like fanfiction. After 6 seasons on the air, the big question is exactly why Game of Thrones seems to suddenly be fulfilling everyone's hopes and desires. It's hard to tell precisely, but several factors seem to be in play. George R.R. Martin's inability to stick to a publishing schedule has created a fascinating dynamic for the show, with Benioff and Weiss working largely off-book at this point. They know Martin's big-picture ideas, but are otherwise able to go their own way in terms of plotting, character turns, and reveals. That's essentially allowed them to create a version of Game of Thrones that's more TV-friendly than it's ever been before. Without upcoming novels demanding a character be at a certain location at a certain time, the showrunners can simply write what's best for their story. This season of Game of Thrones is an affront to geography. The rules are humans can survive 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. Assuming the Suicide Squad were drinking snow, they'd still have been long dead of exposure before Dany showed up. Game of Thrones used to be all about the journey. Now it's all about the destination. The Washington Post in past seasons, journeys facilitated disarmingly funny or poignant moments. For every battle of the Blackwater, there was a lot of aimless meandering that led unexpectedly to exciting adventures or meaningful alliances. Arya and Gendry bonding while sneaking away from King's Landing, or Jon Snow searching for Benjen, but meeting a spunky redhead named Ygritte instead. The evolution of Missandei as one of the most important Game of Thrones characters. BuzzFeed Emmanuel thinks of Missandei's current role as a significant shift and major achievement, considering where she started. Aside from being Daenerys' advisor, she's a member of her small council, the most trusted people within the Queen's inner circle. She's gone from enslaved object and a piece of property to this free-thinking, free-feeling person with emotions, opinions, and authority. and in a way, assertiveness, embroidering Game of Thrones. The New Yorker Michelle Carragher, the principal embroiderer for Game of Thrones, embellished both Cersei's and Daenerys' costumes. Her work has also been worn by the characters Sansa Stark, Margaery Tyrell, Ellaria Sand, Tywin Lannister, and Tommen Baratheon, among others. Carragher grew up in a landscape worthy of the show, the Great Chalk Downs of the Isle of Wight, an ode to Daenerys Targaryen's amazing coat on Game of Thrones. Vulture: this is not Desert Dany, or Nautical Dany, or standing in front of Table Map Dany. No, this is Snow Dany. And you better believe her coat is fur. On this week's episode of Game of Thrones, Jon Snow led a group beyond the wall, and we finally saw this season's secret star, Beric Dondarrion's flaming sword. Turns out, it's not only a great weapon for fighting the undead, it can also cauterize wounds, burn bodies, light decoy fires, and provide heat on a cold winter's night. The actor Richard Dormer fielded our burning questions about the sword, what he thinks about being designated a Firewhite, and how the Band of Brothers formed an actual band. Read the full recap at the New York Times. In a cozy ship's cabin on Sunday, the two designated world savers of Game of Thrones shared sexy time gazes and a pledge to fight together for the future of humankind. You have to see it to know, Daenerys Targaryen told Jon Snow, referring to the zombie apocalypse preparing to descend upon Westeros. Now I know, the thing is, she doesn't know the half of it. Jeremy Egner read the full recap at the New York Times.